Are we just as bad as the religious? That's what our video today thinks is true, and I think they're just idiots, and I'll let you make up your own mind about that once you've watched it. Because these people just aren't that smart, and when you're so busy running around with the goalposts and playing make-believe that you can't see reality whizzing by your head, you've got some problems. So let's go take a look. I don't really do a lot of creationist videos for the same reason I don't do a lot of flat earth videos. It's just dumb and a complete waste of time. However, this time I wanted to take a look at Answers in Genesis Canada for a talk about logical fallacies, and I'm going to let our host explain how everyone is guilty, except we're not, and how the religious aren't doing anything wrong, except they are, because these people just aren't that bright. So let's let them prove it once again.
Does absence of evidence mean evidence of absence?
Not directly, no. Although certainly where we'd expect to find evidence for something and none exists, that's a pretty good indication that the proposition in question isn't true. See, this is yet another problem that I think many people have recognized, that the religious tend to present a very childlike view of reality, and a lot of their statements are so simplistic as to be utterly useless in the real world. Not that I suppose that's all that surprising, but I just wanted to point it out. So let's get back to the video and see where this goes.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Skin, where we look at how you can think about any faith-challenging message and arrive at a biblical, logical conclusion yourself.
Now, listen to exactly how she put that. How can you address any faith-challenging message and essentially rationalize your way around it? Because your faith just can't be wrong, right? That's really everything you need to know right there to see just how ridiculous religion is. It's starting with a position of emotional comfort, picking the conclusion because it makes you happy, and then demanding that because the conclusion strokes their fee-fees, that it absolutely must be true before even looking at the evidence. Because the evidence doesn't matter, only the blind faith does. If the facts come into conflict with your beliefs, throw the facts out. And creationism is one of the worst in that regard, because they don't give a damn about the facts. They openly ignore the evidence. They just want to believe. And that's just stupid.
I'm Patricia Engler, and today let's examine a certain type of fallacy or faulty logic which may show up on both sides of the creation-evolution controversy, called appeal to ignorance.
It's almost entirely on your side, sorry. There are a lot of different closely related fallacies that Christians are typically guilty of because of the completely irrational way that their faith is put together. You can get the appeal to ignorance, and I'm going to define a couple of these things because the religious often get it completely wrong, but the appeal to ignorance is the one in which you say that because there is no evidence against your claim, it must be true. There's also the appeal to personal incredulity, which we've all seen before. I can't imagine this being false, therefore it must be true. And if you notice at the beginning of this video, that's pretty much what she was doing. Or you can say, I can't imagine any other way for this to work, therefore I'm right. Yeah, but it doesn't work like that, does it? There's also the argument from self-knowing, which says, I just know it if it was true, but since I don't know it, it must be false. And then there's the inverse, which the religious use constantly, which says, if it was false, I'd know it, but since I believe it's true, it has to be. The religious suffer from all of these and more. But let's see her mess it all up.
This fallacy happens when someone claims that a message must be false because there's no evidence for it to be true, or true because there's no evidence against it. For example, say two friends are out fishing when one says there are probably sharks around because there's no evidence that sharks can't live here. The other friend might respond, well, of course there are no sharks here. I've been fishing here for years and I've never caught one.
Now, the second statement that they've never caught a shark, while it isn't proof that there are no sharks, it's pretty decent evidence of that fact, especially if you consider the fact that no one has ever caught a shark. In that instance, we would expect that if there were sharks, there would be evidence thereof, and in the example given, there just aren't. If we expand it beyond the single fisherman to everyone who's ever fished there and still no sharks have ever been caught or seen, or there's never been any evidence of any kind, that's a pretty good reason to suspect that there aren't sharks. Of course, that could still be false. There could be a species of shark living at the very bottom that never gets caught and never gets seen. But the simple fact is, the only time that we ought to believe something is true is when we have demonstrable evidence for it. We shouldn't believe that there are any sharks until we have evidence for sharks. And that's how rationality works, which is why the religious don't understand it. Because that's not how the religious operate. Kind of a problem if you think about it.
Both friends just used the appeal to ignorance fallacy. After all, it's theoretically possible for sharks to be present even if nobody's seen them, or to be absent even if there's no evidence that they couldn't be present. And remember, by evidence, we're talking about facts from observational science. That definition is important to keep in mind, especially when discussing evolution.
But not creationism, at least that's the implication that the creationists like to give. Because they don't actually have to support anything that they're flapping their lips at, according to them. That's because their position is based on faith, not fact. There is nothing observational that can back it up. They're running around with the goalposts, pretending that reality only applies to the other side, never their own. Because they've got fifis, and they don't need to be bothered with things like evidence, logic, or reason. Of course, this is exactly why I don't play double standards. We only need one, and everything must conform to it. Any claim that does not or cannot, it can safely be rejected until something better comes along. And that means all of this woo-woo bullshit isn't worth considering until they manage to produce positive evidence that it's true or likely true. Funny how the religious don't even try to do that, right?
For instance, I remember my first year biology professor telling our class there is not a single piece of evidence against evolution. Now, if we're talking about evolution in the sense of one kind of animal changing into a distinctly different kind over time, there actually are plenty of facts from observational science. In other words, pieces of evidence that cause problems for this idea.
Not really. I mean, the creationists are infamous for twisting data to their own ends, but in every instance that I've ever seen, actual science understands how and why these problems are not valid. Of course, the creationists, they really aren't interested in any of that because, as I said, they've got an emotionally comforting conclusion that they just have to reach whether the data supports it or not. And the only way a lot of them can do it, especially when it comes to evolution, is to try to poke holes in the science as if that somehow proves that their own ideas are true. And that's not how it works. The only way to prove creationism is true is by proving creationism is true, and they simply can't do that because creationism is just ego-stroking bullshit. Funny how these people won't acknowledge the truth, isn't it?
As you can learn about through resources like the ones linked to this video.
Oh, you mean creationist crap that doesn't stand up to even the most lenient of scrutiny. Of course, as with all theists, AIG Canada is only making videos for the already faithful. They're not concerned about actually proving their side right or the other side legitimately wrong. Why? Because who cares about that, right? It's all about comforting the faithful and not providing objectively verifiable facts that anyone can look at. It's about making a buck and gaining followers, not doing recognizable science. Because that's why these groups are such a ridiculous laughingstock. They just don't care. They have an agenda, and they're going to play along no matter how ridiculous the whole thing is. And it's why AIG Canada is really such a treasure trove.
But even if there weren't, saying molecules to man evolution happened because there's no evidence to the contrary would be an appeal to ignorance. But you know, I've seen evolutionists say that creationists often use appeals to ignorance too.
What else do they have? Now, I want to step back and look at the dismissive tone that creationists often employ regarding evolution, as though they actually accurately depict the real science that goes into it. But again, creationists are just trying to give current believers a hand job because that's really all they exist to do. In any legitimate contest between two competing ideas, both sides would stand up with the very best evidence they can come up with, and the best supported idea would win. Creationists can't do that because they have no actual evidence on their side. They just have blind faith and a book of mythology and a feeling that they just have to be right and absolutely nothing else. And that's why they can only go on the attack, badly as it turns out, because they have nothing else intelligent to say. Yeah, big surprise there.
For example, when talking about the lack of transitional forms like half-bird, half-dinosaurs in the fossil record compared to what Darwin himself would have predicted.
And he wouldn't have predicted that. See, this is where the creationists always have problems. They don't comprehend the actual predictions of science because they just don't care. They invent this absurd nonsense in their heads and then pretend that that's what everybody else must mean as well. Yeah, except that's not how it works. It's why, to trot out yet another fallacy, they are invested in good old-fashioned strawmanning. The people they're talking to, they have no clue what's actually going on. So if the creationists have to just make something up out of whole cloth, well, that's just fine because their audience won't know any better. Because their audience is just as stupid as they are. It's really no wonder these dipshits wind up falling for the most ridiculous things.
Evolutionists, including the writer of my evolutionary biology textbook, often respond that there are plenty of specimens interpreted as being as transitional fossils.
In reality, every fossil is a transitional fossil between its parents and the offspring. There are billions and billions and billions of transitional fossils out there. They're just not the silly misconceptions and misrepresentations that the creationists think there ought to be, crocoducks and shit like that. Because again, the creationists are just using straw men as a foundational principle. They can't just take what science says at face value. They have to make something up so that it sounds more ridiculous to their incredulous audience than what actual science is. There is no half-bird, half-reptile fossils, and there never will be, because that's not how biology operates. Nobody ever said that that was going to happen, except for the creationists who just like to yank it all out of their asses. And this has been going on since the early 80s with Henry Morris and Duane Gish. They were complete idiots back then, too.
Although you can learn about some of the problems with these interpretations in the linked resources.
Well, we can learn about your lies about said quote-unquote problems by reading the stupid shit that you claim with no legitimate evidence nor any verifiable understanding of the actual science. It's at least useful for that, I guess.
They add that even if there weren't such specimens, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And technically, that's true.
Because, and I know you don't understand this or care, But fossilization is a relatively rare event. Very, very few animals ever got fossilized, and we can really only look at those rare creatures that did in order to make our judgments on. However, we do have a ton of transitionals. Archaeopteryx, Australopithecus afarensis, Pachycetids, and Ambulocetus, which were the transitional fossils between hoofed land animals and whales. Tiktaalik. I mean, you can even go back and look at the plant evolution of seeds with the fossils of Runcaria. And this is really why they keep going back to Darwin, because they can't handle addressing modern science. Because these are dumb people. They haven't figured out anything since Darwin's time. Well, guess what? Life has moved on since then. These people really are stupid. They just don't have to keep proving it.
The fact that we don't see definite, clear, transitional forms in the fossil record can't itself prove those forms never existed, sort of like the fact that we haven't clearly seen human and dinosaur fossils together can't itself indicate that humans didn't live with dinosaurs. It just means they weren't buried together.
But the fact that radiometric dating of human and dinosaur bones proving that they were separated by, at a dead minimum, 65 million years does. Because, again, this is somewhere that we'd expect to see evidence of cohabitation, but we don't. This is something the religious need to have happen because they have a conclusion that they have to reach, and they don't really give a damn if it's true. They're not out examining the data. They're cherry-picking because their emotions require that their egos have to be right in their beliefs, or they're going to feel really, really bad. This isn't about intellect. This is about feelings. And this is why these people are such ridiculous jokes.
So, to keep from using an appeal to ignorance, we can adjust our wording to say not that the lack of fossil evidence disproves evolution, especially because science being inductive can't conclusively prove things anyway. Instead, we could point out that the available fossil evidence is inconsistent with many predictions of evolution.
Really? Such as? And I mean modern science, not Darwin, because the religious don't seem to understand that a lot of things have changed since Darwin's time. Well, I think some of them understand it, they just don't care. It's inconvenient to have to stay up on the modern scholarship. Therefore, since their audience isn't that bright to begin with, they just keep saying the same old, tired, completely disproven crap they always have, and their followers just keep throwing money at them because they're just dumb. This is what religion does. I hope no one is surprised.
But more consistent with what we'd expect to see from a global flood, like what Genesis talks about.
Except you have none of that at all. Because again, looking at the evidence that we'd expect to see, there just isn't any for a global flood. What we do see is entirely inconsistent with a flood interpretation, if that was possible in the first place, which it simply isn't. There just isn't enough water, and the creationists have to just yank empty claims out of their assholes to explain how it might have happened. There is no way in hell that a global flood ever happened, and they have to call on an endless stream of miracles to make their claims seem even remotely valid to even the dumb people in the pews. I did a pretty decent takedown of the flood back in the old podcast days if you want to go look it up. It was a two-parter episode in episodes 7 and 9, and I'll put a link in the description.
Likewise, another type of appeal to ignorance fallacy I've often seen creationists accuse of is the argument from incredulity, which states that a message is false because it's hard to imagine it being true.
And I already brought that up. Now, keep in mind, I don't watch these videos before I write the script, so I had no idea she was going to say that, but this is stuff that's so commonplace that I suppose it was inevitable that she would. Of course, if you look at the creationist literature, or even just Christian theology, it's packed full of that fallacy. They want things to be a certain way, therefore, they insist it must be, because that's what they want to be true. They can't imagine anything else, therefore, God did it. It's just their go-to presumption, even though it's entirely rationally indefensible. Because this is religion, folks. Rationally indefensible. But let's let her keep going.
For instance, if a creationist says it's difficult to fathom how mechanisms like mutation could produce complex new structures, an evolutionist might respond, well, just because you find it difficult to fathom doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Because the scientists have all of the evidence on their side, and the religious have absolutely nothing. Ultimately, it all comes down to the evidence, not your feelings. I'm sure this will come up again when she turns her example around, so yeah, let's watch for it, shall we?
So instead of just pointing out that it's hard to imagine how evolutionary processes could explain the existence of all life as we know it, we can show from observational science why that's so hard to imagine.
Except it's not, because as I said, they have a ton of evidence to back it up. Of course, the creationists never want to talk about that because then they'd have to deal with the evidence, and they can't do that in any rational way. Instead, they just present a skewed perspective and then talk about it in insulting terms because their audience, the only people that they're really willing to talk to, they don't know any better anyhow. If you want to look at how scams and confidence schemes work, this is just textbook.
Not because we lack imagination, but because what we know from observational science is inconsistent with what would have to happen for life in all of its forms to arise naturalistically.
What you know could be written on the head of a pin, a very small pin. What science knows, that's something completely different. But again, they don't want to talk about science because they have no clue nor confidence in what science has actually discovered. Because they just don't care. Fifis, not facts, remember? It's fun just watching the word choices that the creationists use, knowing that it's all a scam behind the scenes. Just try it for yourself sometime. It's a hoot.
That way, we can communicate truth relying on careful reasoning instead of potentially fallacious arguments. Of course, like we've seen in earlier videos, even if someone does use a fallacy to argue for biblical principles, that doesn't change the Bible's truth.
Yeah, how about you prove that? Because they can't do that either. They can't do much of anything that's demonstrably useful. I saw a creationist video not too long ago. I think it was a Ray Comfort thing, if I remember right, where they spent the whole thing talking about the Bible while attacking evolution because their interpretation of the Bible couldn't stand if evolution was true. Then, guess what? That means the Bible isn't true. The only thing that matters is the evidence, and anyone with a decent understanding of the evidence and a modicum of common decency, and honestly, there's no way that the literalist interpretation of the Bible that these idiots have could survive that. It does only because they mix ignorance and fanaticism and throw honesty and integrity right out the window. Welcome to religion once again.
But by avoiding potential fallacies as much as we can better communicate the Bible's truth for those who need the hope it offers. For more on how to think about any message which challenges the Bible's teaching, you can access my other CT scan videos packed with tactics, tips, and tools that helped me as a Christian student at secular university. Thank you for watching.
And this is what happens when you go into it with blind faith instead of an open mind. It's what happens when you go into it caring more about your feelings than you do about the facts. It's really why the religious are terrified of a secular education, because they're just not in control over what gets shoved into the heads of impressionable kids. If they can't do the programming, they don't want anything to do with it. Again, the dangers of childhood indoctrination. It's child abuse. But anyhow, I think this video shows at least some of the things that are wrong with fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity, as if we needed any more examples. It's going back to something that I said earlier. I expected her to provide an example of the Christian side, which she didn't do. Sometimes you just can't predict the religious, sorry. Anyhow, I was expecting her to say something about non-Christians saying something about maybe the resurrection, and just because we have no evidence, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Except, once again, if such a thing did happen, we'd expect a lot more than we actually see, and the things that we do see, the observations, to use her words, that we do see simply don't support that conclusion. Instead, it looks like just about any other cult that we've seen in history. It's oral tradition, a game of telephone, until it was finally written down decades later. And it's far better explained as an invented story over time than something that really happened in history. But they don't want to talk about that either, do they? I mean, this is really the kind of stupid crap that we see coming from the religious on a daily basis. All feels, zero facts. All emotions, no evidence. Because why would they need any of that when they've got an overactive ego? She clearly doesn't understand how to rationally evaluate the world. It's just a bunch of hippy-dippy crap where she doesn't comprehend the deeper implications. Because why would she? It gets in the way of her feelings. I trust I don't have to describe just how stupid that is, do I? Please tell me I don't. At least I expect my audience to be a lot better than that.